January 8, 1945. Mamkwan Harbor, China coast. The biting, salty air of the East China Sea whipped across the bridge, but the tension below the surface was far colder. In the control room of the USS Barb SS-220, a Gato-class submarine, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the air conditioning and the strained breathing of the 20 men crammed together. Every gauge and dial pulsed with silent warning. The target, the Japanese convoy sheltered inside the shallow, mine-choked confines of Mamkwan Harbor, was no ordinary prey. It was a dragon's tooth, and Commander Eugene Fluckey, the submarine's captain, was about to pull it. Fluckey, a man whose piercing gaze and almost unnatural calm had already earned Barb the reputation as the most decorated combat vessel in the Pacific, was leaning over the chart table. The table, however, was bare of any reliable data for their current location. The Imperial Japanese Navy had meticulously avoided publishing charts for this backwater port, knowing its shallow depth and treacherous rocky shoals would serve as a natural defense. Fluckey wasn't just approaching the harbor. He was preparing to drive his 311-foot steel tube right into it, a mission that every textbook on submarine warfare screamed was suicidal. Depth soundings, Mr. Raby. Give it to me in fathoms, Fluckey murmured, his voice cutting through the silence. Ensign Jim Raby, the assistant torpedo officer, swallowed hard, his face illuminated by the faint red glow of the battle lanterns. 22 fathoms, skipper, holding steady. 22 fathoms, 132 feet. The Barb was over 300 feet long. To safely operate, a Gato-class submarine preferred water 5 to 10 times deeper than this. Barb's keel was barely skimming the seabed, navigating blind through a maze of uncharted hazards. Above them, somewhere in the murky darkness, were the acoustic mines the Japanese had scattered like poisonous seeds. Any miscalculation, any sudden shift in the tide, any slight deviation in rudder, and the Barb would either become permanently lodged in the mud, a sitting duck for aerial bombardment, or worse, detonate a mine and send 1,800 tons of submarine and its 80-man crew to the bottom of the Pacific. On the periscope, Fluckey could make out the dark, hulking shapes of his targets. The harbor was packed, over 30 ships, a true bonanza of Japanese logistics, tankers, freighters, troop transports, and most importantly, a massive ammunition ship moored near the main pier. This was the prize. Fluckey knew that sinking one ship was good. Sinking one that took out half the harbor in a secondary explosion was a legend. He straightened up, his focus absolute. His plan was simple and insane, a surface run, full speed, right up the center channel, firing his 8-bow torpedoes in a fan-shaped spread before making a hairpin turn and bolting back out. It was a classic shoot and scoot, but executed in the equivalent of a bathtub. Chief of the boat, Fluckey ordered, his eyes never leaving the periscope. Rig for silent running. Torpedo tubes 1 through 8 open outer doors. Set depth at 6 feet. Get the men ready. We are going in. The men moved with the quiet efficiency of veterans. They had absolute faith in Fluckey, a belief that bordered on religious devotion. They had seen him do the impossible before, but this felt different. This felt like the last mission. The Barb was entering the lair of the enemy, not as a hunter from the deep, but as a surface raider fully exposed, relying on audacity and sheer luck. The tension in the control room tightened into a painful knot, waiting for the final order that would commit them all to the fight. The depth soundings dropped further, 21 fathoms. The seabed was getting closer. The depth soundings dropped further, 21 fathoms. The seabed was getting closer. Fluckey watched the dial for the depth gauge, the needle a pendulum swinging between survival and disaster. He signaled the helmsman, Petty Officer First Class Sam Johnson, to reduce speed slightly, just enough to maintain control without stirring up the mud and giving away their position. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds, granting them a cloak of necessary darkness, but the visibility was still too good for comfort. The faint outline of the shore was visible, punctuated by the dim lights of the enemy ships. 19 fathoms, skipper, Raby whispered, the strain evident in his voice. Less than 114 feet of water. The Barb was practically crawling on her belly. Fluckey gripped the periscope handles tighter. Upscope 1/3. He scanned the congested harbor. They were now within the main mooring area. The massive ammunition ship, designated by intelligence as the USS Barb, filled the lens. It was a perfect target, broadside to their firing position. Japanese sailors, oblivious to the steel predator gliding towards them, could be seen milling about the decks. Range to target 085, approximately 1,500 yards, reported the target data computer operator, his fingers dancing across the keys, inputting the final firing solutions. Fluckey made a critical command: take her up to 7 knots, silent. He was increasing speed inside the harbor, a move unheard of. Audacity was the only defense. He had to close the distance, ensure the torpedoes ran true, and escape before the harbor defenses could react. Solution locked. All 8 tubes ready to fire, the torpedo officer confirmed. Fluckey issued the command that committed them fully to the mission. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. Fire 7. Fire 8. 8 Mark 18 electric torpedoes, the silent, wakeless weapons preferred for close quarters fighting, ejected from the bow tubes in rapid succession. The thrum hiss of the torpedoes leaving the submarine was the loudest sound in the control room. The crew held their breath, counting the agonizing seconds until impact. Fluckey lowered the periscope, giving the torpedoes time to run, and ordered a hard right rudder. The mission had now shifted from attack to survival. Impact. The first explosion ripped through the harbor, followed by a second and a third. The torpedoes had found their marks. Fluckey quickly raised the periscope. The scene was chaos. Steam and fire erupted from the side of the USS Barb. But before he could fully assess the damage, a colossal, blinding flash erupted from the ammunition ship's center mass. Boom! The sound wave hammered the Barb, even underwater, shaking the entire hull. The secondary explosion was magnificent and terrifying. The USS Barb vanished in a pillar of flame and smoke that reached hundreds of feet into the night sky, throwing debris and fragments across the entire harbor. The force of the blast initiated a chain reaction. Nearby freighters shuddered, listing immediately, their decks awash in burning fuel. The whole harbor lit up, turning the night into a brilliant, deadly spectacle. Fluckey could see the superstructure of other ships collapsing, overwhelmed by the cascading fire and shrapnel. The victory was immediate and devastating, but now the consequences began. Japanese shore batteries, startled into action, began firing wildly at the harbor entrance. Simultaneously, Fluckey caught a glimpse of 2 dark shapes peeling away from the central moorings, 2 Japanese destroyers, now racing towards the source of the blast, their sonar pinging the shallow water, searching for the culprit. Their pursuit speed was deadly. Fluckey was inside a trap, and the teeth were closing. The 2 Japanese destroyers, the Ikazuchi and the Inazuma, though their identities were unknown to the crew at the time, their intent was clear: were closing fast. Their high-speed wakes churned the shallow water, and their powerful active sonar began sweeping the narrow channel. Fluckey, still surface running and fully exposed, knew that diving was impossible. The water was simply too shallow for evasion maneuvers, and the risk of grounding was extreme. His only option was to outrun them, which, for a World War II submarine, was a contradiction in terms. All ahead flank. Fluckey roared, gripping the helm controls, as he piloted the massive boat personally. Emergency surface speed. Blow all ballast tanks. Chief, I want 150% overload on those motors now. The demand for 150% overload was unheard of in peacetime operation. It risked burning out the electric drive motors immediately, risking the entire propulsion system for the sake of a desperate sprint. Chief Motor Machinist, Mate John Miller, didn't hesitate. Deep in the engine room, he and his crew pushed the diesel-electric systems far beyond their rated capacity. The motors began to whine, with a high, strained pitch, vibrating the hull violently. The temperature gauges immediately spiked, glowing bright red. The Barb shuddered, protesting the abuse, but she began to move. On the bridge, as the Barb skimmed the water, Fluckey could see the destroyers visually now, less than 2 miles away and closing rapidly, their bow waves slicing through the water. He ordered the remaining stern torpedo tubes readied, a last resort against ships capable of running 3 times his normal top speed. The crew in the control room monitored the speed log with grim fascination. The needle began to climb past the theoretical limits of the Gatto-class design. 15 knots, skipper. 17 knots. The air in the control room was thick with heat and the smell of ozone from the overworked motors. The boat was handling sluggishly, barely responsive in the shallow, turbulent water, and the helm struggled to keep her straight as they dodged the chaotic currents caused by the recent explosions. 20 knots. She's flying, skipper. The limit for a submerged Gatto was around 8.7 knots, and 20 knots on the surface was already pushing the boundaries of its hull design. Fluckey kept pushing. He knew the destroyers were about to have a fire control solution, and the first salvos of high-explosive shells would begin raining down any second. 23.5 knots. The speed log showed an impossible number. The USS Barb had just set a new unofficial world speed record for a combat submarine, a record achieved not in a deep water test range, but in a panicked, adrenaline-fueled sprint through a minefield with 2 destroyers hot on her tail. It was the absolute maximum the overloaded electrical plant could deliver before literally tearing itself apart. The destroyer's guns flashed. The first 5-inch shells landed in the water nearby, throwing up huge geysers of spray that washed over the Barb's exposed bridge. Shrapnel from a near miss peppered the conning tower. Fluckey, unshakable, kept the Barb on a straight, desperate course toward the open sea, relying on his speed, the low profile of the sub, and the chaos of the burning harbor to sow confusion among the pursuers. They were gaining ground, but the Barb was holding her lead, her engines screaming their protest against the forced march. The escape was measured in yards and seconds. The shelling intensified. The Japanese destroyers, now just over a mile astern, were firing in earnest, their tracers arcing across the water in search of the fleeting, low silhouette of the submarine. One shell exploded close enough to the port quarter to rattle the Barb structure, knocking loose dust and debris inside the hull. Fluckey remained on the bridge, the spray and concussive blasts washing over him, a human guidepost directing their mad dash. Maintain flank speed. Rudder steady at 090, Fluckey commanded, his voice clear despite the din of the engines and the nearby explosions. The chief quartermaster frantically consulted the limited, hand-drawn navigational sketches they had managed to put together before the mission, not official charts, but Fluckey's own educated guesses about the harbor's topography. The immediate danger wasn't just the destroyers, but the unlit, rocky shoals that marked the final barrier between the shallow harbor and the comparative safety of the deep, open ocean. Navigating this bottleneck at 23.5 knots was akin to steering a freight train through a dark, narrow canyon. Suddenly, a loud, grinding noise reverberated through the hull. The Barb scraped bottom, sending a horrifying vibration through the entire boat. "We've hit bottom. 15 fathoms. Raby yelled, his voice cracking with fear. The friction from a scrape, though momentary, threatened to destabilize their steering and potentially damage the hydroplanes or propellers. Worse, it was a huge sound signature for the pursuing destroyers, who immediately targeted the area where the disturbance occurred. The Ikazuchi launched a salvo of flares, illuminating the churning water around the Barb with an eerie white light. Fluckey's reaction was immediate and surgical. Left 10 degrees rudder. Steady up on 255. Raby, full down angle on the planes. He was using the boat's control surfaces to physically lift the bow and pull the stern clear of the rocks, a move requiring supreme confidence and control in this depth. The Barb groaned, but obeyed. They had passed the worst of the shoals. The water depth agonizingly slowly began to increase, 18 fathoms, then 20, then 25. With the deeper water came the immediate temptation to dive and escape, but Fluckey resisted. Diving now would drop their speed instantly, allowing the destroyers to close the gap and pin them down with depth charges. Their only advantage was the fleeting speed record they had just established. As the Barb burst into the open sea, The first faint light of the January dawn began to smear the eastern horizon. The destroyers, recognizing that the submarine had slipped out of the shallow trap and was making a clean getaway, shifted their tactics. Instead of a close pursuit, they slowed and began a sweeping search pattern near the harbor mouth. Hoping the Barb would attempt a dive they could counter, Fluckey took the opportunity to assess the damage. Miraculously, despite the near misses and the grounding, the hull was intact, and the engines, though smoking and requiring immediate cooling, were still running. He held his breath for another 5 minutes, putting precious distance between his vessel and the harbor. Only when the destroyer's silhouettes were fading specks on the horizon did Fluckey give the long-awaited command. His voice husky with exhaustion and triumph. Dive. Rig for patrol depth. The Barb submerged, slipping silently back into the protective embrace of the deep, leaving behind the flames and ruin of Mamkwan Harbor, a harbor now significantly lighter by over 30,000 tons of sunken Japanese shipping. The Barb descended to 150 feet, the pressure hull groaning softly as the massive boat stabilized. The transition from the chaos of the surface sprint to the silent, dark calm of the deep was jarring. Below, the heat from the overworked engines slowly began to dissipate. The air was thick with a faint scent of burnt insulation and oil, but the men in the control room were exchanging tired, relieved smiles. They had done it. They had executed an unauthorized, textbook-defying suicide mission, and survived. Commander Fluckey finally stepped away from the periscope pedestal, his fatigue visible only in the lines etched around his eyes. He ordered a slow, cautious retreat from the area. The intelligence gathered later would confirm the astonishing success of the Mamkwan raid. Not only was the massive ammunition ship destroyed, the secondary explosions accounted for 3 additional large freighters, but the initial spread of torpedoes had sunk or heavily damaged at least 4 other vessels moored in the congested port. 30 ships were successfully attacked, with confirmed sinkings reducing the Japanese tonnage in the area by tens of thousands of tons. The sheer audacity of the maneuver, entering a shallow, uncharted, mined, and heavily defended harbor on the surface, firing a full salvo, and escaping at a record-breaking speed, captured the imagination of the entire Pacific Fleet Command. It was not just a successful attack. It was a demonstration of tactical brilliance and unflinching bravery that stood out even in the annals of submarine warfare. The sheer risk involved, particularly the decision to operate in less than 20 fathoms of water while exposed, cemented the operation's legendary status. When the Barb finally returned to her base at Majuro Atoll, the accolades began pouring in. Fluckey's superiors, while initially perhaps aghast at the operational risks he took, could not ignore the catastrophic damage inflicted on the enemy. The formal recommendations were immediately drawn up. On January 23, 1945, Commander Eugene B. Fluckey was awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration, for his extraordinary heroism in taking the USS Barb into the hostile, shallow waters of Mamkwan Harbor. The citation explicitly referenced the skill and courage with which he navigated the submerged hazards and the ultimate success of the attack, which inflicted grievous harm on the Japanese logistical train. Fluckey's achievement was more than just a single engagement. It personified the aggressive, highly successful, and often unorthodox tactics employed by the Silent Service during the war. He would continue to lead the Barb on further daring missions, including the famous instance where his crew went ashore in Japan to destroy a train with a scuttled torpedo, the only known landing operation on the Japanese mainland during the war. But the Mamkwan Harbor raid, the surface dash, and the world's speed record of 23.5 knots would forever remain the crowning glory of his command. It stands as a testament to the belief that in war, sometimes the most impossible path is the only one that guarantees victory.